We are delighted now to hear a man whom we heard in a very brief moment on Wednesday night in the opening of the crusade, David MacLagan. He is pastor of Moncrief Parish Church, Glasgow, Scotland. And he is going to come and share with us his experience in coming to know Jesus Christ and what it has meant right now. Brother MacLagan, we appreciate so much. I believe that if we were giving an attendance banner for our speakers, you would get the banner this time. Because I think you're the only one that's flown the Atlantic, and you've been here long enough to have adjusted to the time. I have no idea what time it is in Glasgow, but I know it's the right time here. We are so pleased that you're with us.
Can I simply say what a great joy it is for me to be in America for this just the second time, and I have been asked to enlarge on the story that I had to condense on very strict orders on Wednesday night to 3 minutes. Really what I'm going to say to you this afternoon is very much the story of my life. I was brought up in a manse. My father was a minister. And yet the strange thing is that I'm standing here speaking to you this afternoon, not because my father was a minister, but in spite of the fact that my father was a minister, and by the time I have finished speaking, I trust I shall have made myself clear. But being the son of a pastor, I had certain great disadvantages, and one was I knew more than was good for me about the institutional church and some people who carried a big Bible under their arm and masqueraded under the name of a Christian. As a very young boy, I realized that if your father is a pastor, then you are expected to be different from every other little boy. Folk have a strange idea, about pastor sons. They believe that you not only should have the face of an angel, but that you ought to behave as one as well. I remember when this came home to me very, very forcibly. As a young boy, we lived in Glasgow, and like all boys in Glasgow, we were fond of playing football. While there was a good park to play in, of course, it's much more exciting to play football in the street. And we used to play football in the street. And I remember one day we were playing there, and we were making a greater noise than usual when one of the people who lived in a nearby house, a lady, very angry at the noise we were making, opened her door and began to remonstrate with us. And then suddenly her eyes rested on this little fair-haired lad right in the middle. She turned around and she said, "And as for you, David MacLagan, you should be thoroughly ashamed of yourself. Your father's a pastor here, you ought to know better." There it was. I was meant to be different from all other boys. The same disadvantages I felt in the church. Your father's a pastor, you haven't really much alternative. You have to go to all the meetings whether you like it or not. You have to attend all the Bible studies, and if they have a Bible exam, for the young children, you're part of the pastor. If you don't get the top mark, you're for it. Yeah. Young children too can come to church at a very early age and be permitted to look at a book during the sermon, as long as it's quiet. Mum and Dad are quite pleased, and I remember the Sunday that I began to look at a book. It was actually the hymn book, and sometimes there's better theology in the hymn book than you get from the pulpit. And I began to turn over the pages when suddenly there was a deathly silence. My father's voice boomed out, "David, could I have your attention?" And needless to say, I sat still throughout the remainder of his learned exegesis. One can also, of course, in the church find as a pastor son that your honesty can get you into hot water. I remember I would be about 14 at the time, I suppose, when an evangelist came to conduct a series of meetings in the church, and he did what he should never have done, really. He was preaching far too long. He went on and on and on, and people began to get up out of the seats. They had buses to catch, and the evangelist stopped and said, if there was anyone in the church that felt at the time he stopped preaching would kindly signify and put their hand up. Well, the church was absolutely packed, and I was sitting right at the very front of the gallery, and that was too good a chance to miss, so Joe. The trouble was I was the only hand in the church that went up. And needless to say, when I got home, I came into contact with a heavier hand. But this was me in my young, tender years, and I felt I was at a disadvantage being in the manse, as we call it in Scotland. And I moved from that to a position where I began to realize it was very, very much harder, as far as I was concerned, for me to become a Christian. Why? Well, you see, all the quarrels that were going on inside the church, all the criticisms that were being said about other pastors, other denominations, all the terrible comments about evangelists, I heard all about it. It was all very well. Fellow ministers in the town where I lived criticizing the one who was a pastor and an evangelist. He wasn't my pastor. He wasn't my evangelist. He was my father. And then the struggle started. I couldn't get near Jesus Christ for the folk in the church. And I think for that reason, I hold very strongly. It is possible, yes, for some of you here this afternoon, to be deep in the church and shallow in your religious experience. Being a member of a church, being a pastor of a church, is no criterion of your experience of Jesus Christ. As a teenager, the Bible I was interested in reading was not that Bible. The only Bible I was wanting to read was people's lives who claimed to be Christian. And some of their life stories I didn't find worth reading. Can I ask you pointedly, as I remind you, as pastors, you are the only Bible folk in your town can be bothered to read. Can I ask you gently, are you worth reading? Are you? There came a man to our home in Glasgow once, an American, by the name of Philip Ewey, and today I understand he's a pastor in the Church of the Nazarene over here. He came to stay in our home and he conducted a series of meetings, and his sermons left me singularly unmoved. But he stayed in our home for 3 months. It fell to me, we were living in London by this time, and it fell to me to show him round London. And we had many a happy afternoon and a great time as I showed him St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey and all the places that one would wish to see. Never once in 3 months did that pastor speak to me about Jesus Christ or Christianity. Not one. And yet that's not true. He was speaking to me every moment that I was in his company, never with his lips, always with his life. The day came for him to leave, and I remember, as if it were yesterday, he stood in the kitchen of our home and he put out his hand and he said, "David, You and I have been great friends. I trust you won't waste all the years of your life without getting to know the best friend of all. You could say that to me because he lived what he preached. But you see, all pastors, all Christians weren't like him. And hence, I was glad a few months later when the time came for me to leave school and go into the army. When I went into the army, I turned my back completely on the church because I was critical and cynical, because I knew far too much about it. People who tried to ram that Bible down my throat, and they did not practice what they preached. During my spell, 2 years in the army, I never darkened the door of a church. I came out of the army having been commissioned, and then I went, as some of you heard the other night, to Cambridge. And at Cambridge, I was still cynical and sneering. And then Billy Graham came to Haringey to hold his crusade, and I was angry. You wouldn't care very much if I came over to America and told you people what to do about the race problem. I didn't care very much for Billy Graham coming over and telling Great Britain what to do about our religious problem. I was angry at this man coming. However, I decided to go to Haringey to hear him, to have a cheap night out, as you heard already, to mock him and to sneer. And I went. At least I was intellectually honest with myself, because while I had determined that it was the emotion that brought these people forward as I sat in my seat that night, I couldn't understand why these people immediately got up and came forward. Because to me, it was very unemotional. And it certainly didn't move me that night. So I decided to go back. And I went back to Haringey time and time again. Then I vowed I'd never go back, because I realized if I did go back, that this man was going to get me out of my seat and to the front, and that I was determined he would never do. Then Billy Graham came one night to Cambridge. It was a Sunday night, and he preached in the university church. And I wish you had seen him, because it was rather a strange thing to see Billy Graham in that church. There was no Cliff Barrows, there was no Beverly Shane, there was no choir, so any argument I might have had about you being softened up first had gone. And Billy Graham had the surplice of an Anglican minister on, and he went into the pulpit. Can't remember a word of what he said, except that at the end of the sermon, he said, "The reason some of you listening to me now will not commit your life to Christ is because you haven't the guts." It'll cost you something. It could cost you your career and your ambition. That is why you will not commit your life to Christ. It involves taking up a cross, and you haven't the guts. And boy, that was David MacLagan. But I didn't wait behind at the invitation. Scotsmen are not easily moved, and I was determined no American was going to move me. Now I'm back to my room. And at that time I was sharing rooms with a young man who was training to be a Methodist minister. Now you may say it's kind of strange, a cynic, somebody like me sharing rooms with somebody who was going to become a minister. I did it deliberately so that I could persecute them. And they used to hold weekly prayer meetings, and I used to say to them, boy, it'll not do you any good praying for me. And every Wednesday, he and 6 other young men who were studying to be ministers held a prayer meeting in that room. That night when I came back from hearing Billy preach at Cambridge, there was none of them to be found. So I decided to go around all the students' rooms to where they would be, and sure enough, I eventually found them. A lot of them all in one room, and as I went into that room, you could have cut the atmosphere with a knife. They were destroying Billy Graham, his message and his methods. And as I walked through the door, they said, and what did you think, David? I said, I'll tell you what I think. I said, that man nearly won me to Christ tonight. I said, but you people couldn't be bothered thinking of that, could you? The effect he was having upon people like me who never go to church. I said, but I'll tell you now what I think. If I never put my foot inside the door of a church again, you will have something to answer for. Can I say this to you? Be very careful. The criticism you level against somebody who is preaching the gospel in a different way from you, your criticism could drive them outside the church forever. Well, my friend got all upset, but it didn't do him any good. The church. I couldn't see and get near Jesus Christ because of the representatives of the church. But by this time, the Holy Spirit was beginning to work in my life on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Oh boy. I was fighting and couldn't get this out of my mind. You haven't the gut. So on the Friday, I decided once and for all I would throw off this feeling and get rid of the way that Billy Graham's message was haunting me once and for all. I left Cambridge with a fella who had no time at all for the church. We drove up to London that night and decided we would go to a football game. When we got to Trafalgar Square in the centre of London, I said to him, I don't want to go to the football game. I want to go to Haringey and hear Billy Graham once more. Oh, for goodness sake, my friend said if you told me that before we left Cambridge. I said, look, you go to the football game, I shall go to Haringey, and we'll meet here afterwards. Oh, I said, no. If you're going to go to Haringey, I'll go. I said, no, you go to the football game. Because by this time I knew what was going to happen. And I thought this guy is going to go back to Cambridge and he's going to say, oh yeah, you wouldn't believe it. You'd never believe who's decided to go all holy and become a Christian. Well, he came. We had a job to get in because the place was nearly full, but Scotsmen never take no for an answer, and I didn't take no from any Englishman at the door of Haringey that night. And in we got, and I was right away up at the back of Haringey. And Billy preached, and I can't remember what he said. He made the invitation, they were all at the front. And I had watched and studied closely. And you don't need me to tell you that when Billy makes his appeal, make it one. And they come immediately. He stands back and he does that. He never says another word till he's speaking to those at the front. But that night at Haringey, I was still in my seat. They were all at the front. Billy Graham stepped forward. He said, before I speak to those of you who have come forward, I want to say this. I feel compelled to say it. There's a young man somewhere in this vast arena, and you haven't the guts. And at that, I was up on my feet. Because I came out The counsellor didn't come, and I got lost in this vast corridor at the top of Haringey. It was just me, this wee fella, going along. This big corridor all by myself, no idea how to get to the front. And suddenly, as I passed the emergency exit doors, the doors suddenly flew open, and bang, just like that, this immaculately dressed man came through the door. He looked at me and he said, "The young man has been sent." And I looked at him, he looked at me, and he said, "You're from Cambridge, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, I know that only because I recognize the scar." He says, "Let me tell you something." He says, "I'm an Anglican, and the headmaster of a school in London. I'm a counsellor at this crusade. I was on duty Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Tonight was my night off. I was sitting marking papers in the study of my home. 8:30, I knew I had to get the car out of the garage, drive to Haringey. There was someone I had to speak to. He says, the car park was full. I drew up outside these doors a minute ago and came through them and met you. There is not a man in the world today who could convince me that that was coincidence. That man was sent to properly counsel a cynic into the kingdom of God." After my conversion that night, I finished my course at Cambridge, and I'd always wanted to be a school, I think we call them teachers, here we call them schoolmasters. I'd always wanted to be a school teacher. I entered the school teaching profession, and I was in that profession for 7 years. But I began to become involved in the church, and I became a lay preacher. I take it you know what that means. I went out on Sundays preaching in varying Methodist churches. And I had no intention of ever becoming a minister. I wanted to teach, and can I say this to you this afternoon? I still want to be a school teacher. It's not what David MacLagan wants. It's what God demands. And a second battle was beginning to develop in my life, because becoming a Christian is only the beginning, not the end. I went out preaching on Sundays, and then a famous German visited the church of which I attended. I refer to Dr. Martin Niemöller, the great German pastor who was a U-boat commander in the First World War and was imprisoned and tortured by the Gestapo in the Second World War because of his denunciation of Hitler. And my head was about that size because I had been asked to go there and preach, because they invited guest preachers up from London, men like Dr. Sangster, Soper, and Weatherhead, and for some reason, don't ask me why, they asked David MacLagan along one Sunday night to preach, and this church was absolutely packed to the door, and I preached, and I went to the door afterwards, and I was shaking hands and saying good night to people, and this man, an absolute stranger, he passed me, he said, "Someday, young man, you're going to have something to answer for." I looked at him. He says, "You know what I mean." He said, "The collar and the tie." Now, I think you know that in Scotland I wouldn't be wearing this. I would have a clerical collar on, as a pastor. We're very conservative in Scotland and over there. He said to me, "You'll have something to answer for, your collar and tie. You ought to be a minister. I suppose you haven't the guts." And I had 20 miles to drive home, and instead of my ego at being asked to preach in this church, all I could think of was this phrase over and over again: To bring a long story to a conclusion, as I got home that night, I went to school next day to teach and had a bit of a struggle. When I came back from the boarding school that night, I had been on duty till 10 o'clock. My wife said, "Oh, the magazine has just arrived," and this was the magazine of the Church of Scotland. It's called Life and Work. As I was sitting waiting for my wife to make supper, I opened it, and the moderator of the General Assembly, at that time was Dr. Neville Davidson, had an article in which he was pointing out the shortage of candidates in the ministry in the Church of Scotland, and he asked the reader to pray that young men would offer themselves as candidates for the ministry. I couldn't say my prayers that night. How could I ask God to send somebody else to do what I knew deep in my heart I ought to do? It's an awful lot of people, don't they, who say, "Here am I, God, but please send my brother." Well, that was it. The very next morning I went in and resigned my post as a school teacher. I left England. I returned to Glasgow, where I took my theological training, and after that I went to Moncrief Parish Church near Glasgow. Unfortunately, something has happened since I was asked to come and speak here, and the details in your program are not quite correct about me. I am no longer the minister of Moncrief Church. It was indeed a very large church with 2,500 members. There was a Sunday school, and when I say Sunday school, their ages of 3 to 11. It was 1,250 children in the Sunday school, 3 to 11, every Sunday. It was my first pastorate. There was a lot of eyebrows raised when I got it. It's a very well-known church indeed. 5 weeks ago, I left it. I left it for a church that's much smaller. I haven't gone that way, I've gone that way. Can I say this to you, and I don't say it boastfully or with any pride at all? There are no young people in the church at all, spiritually dead. I think you know that pastors in Britain, I would think the same applies in certain churches here anyway, but pastors in Britain are not well paid. I've taken a drop of $1,000 in my salary, and my salary was only $3,500. 5 are gone. Simply this, it's not what David MacLagan wants. But God demands, and I know He has sent me to this dead and this empty church. It's in a place large, a seaside resort, and I look out of the door of the church, right up the Holy Loch, and I can see the American Polaris submarines from the very door of my church. That will give you an idea where it is. Before I finish, I want to share one other incident with you. I want to be back in Scotland to take my services this Sunday. I want to tell you something about the minister who is occupying my pulpit this Sunday. He's the full-time presbytery clerk of Dumbarton, which is a big county in Scotland, and the presbytery clerk is a pretty powerful figure in the Presbyterian Church. As a young minister, he went to hear Billy Graham at Kelvin Hall, and when the appeal was made, he went to get up onto his feet, and an older minister next to him grabbed his jacket and he pulled him back down and he said, "Don't be a fool. You don't need to do that. You'll make a fool of yourself. Sit down." And he sat down. And he told me he wasted the next 12 years of his life. He knew about Christ. He didn't know him. For 12 years he was the pastor of a church. Wasted. Until 12 years later, he went to the famous Keswick Convention. And after one of the meetings one night, he did what he should have done 12 years before. How many pastors there are out there who, like my friend, are wasting their time. Wasting. I believe there are three kinds of Christians. There are those in which the life of Christ is present. There are those in which the life of Christ is prominent. There are those in which the life of Christ is preeminent. Jesus Christ is not preeminent in your life, in your preaching. You are wasting your time. It's a terrible thing for a pastor to be wasting his time, God's time. I want to ask you this afternoon a very pointed question. The whole point of my story is to try and get this question through to you. I'm not asking you, are you the pastor of a successful church? I'm asking you, are you the pastor of a spiritual church? Is Jesus Christ preeminent in your church? If he's not preeminent in your preaching, in your life, in your witness, in your outreach, you are wasting your time. A comedian has not communicated who doesn't make his audience laugh. A pastor has not communicated who doesn't lead his congregation closer to their Lord and Master. You know, as a pastor, if I've got